For years, Afghanistan's war has been shown through battles and politics. But the real story often hides in the lives of families connected to power. As violence grew more personal, women, especially those linked to Taliban figures, found themselves caught in a world they never chose. And the leaked footage exposed just how brutal things had become. To really understand how things got this brutal, we'll see Afghanistan before everything collapsed. Not the war-torn version people think of today, but a country that was changing fast, especially in cities. In the early 1970s, Kabul had universities filled with students, including women studying medicine, law, and engineering. And you could see women working in offices, teaching in schools, and walking around without fear in many parts of the capital. This period was during the rule of Mohammad Zahir Shah, who had been king since 1933. And even after he was overthrown in 1973 by his cousin Mohammad Daoud Khan, the push toward modernization didn't suddenly stop, at least not right away. But things started to shift quickly after 1978, when a communist coup known as the Sour Revolution brought a new government into power backed by the Soviet Union. That government tried to force major changes, like land reforms and strict control over society. And many Afghans, especially in rural areas, strongly resisted it. This resistance is what slowly turned into armed rebellion. Then came the turning point in December 1979, when the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan to support that struggling government. And that's when everything really fell apart. The war that followed lasted almost 10 years from 1979 to 1989. And it wasn't just a local conflict anymore. It became part of the Cold War. The United States, Pakistan, and Saudi Arabia poured money, weapons, and training into Afghan fighters known as the Mujahideen, while the Soviets sent in tens of thousands of troops, heavy weapons, and air power. Villages were bombed, farmland was destroyed, and millions of civilians were caught in the middle. By the mid-1980s, over 5 million Afghans had fled the country, mostly into Pakistan and Iran, turning it into one of the largest refugee crises in the world at that time. Entire generations grew up in refugee camps, especially in places like Peshawar and Quetta. And those camps later became a key part of what came next. Among the Mujahideen, some commanders became well known, and one of the most respected was Ahmad Shah Massoud, often called the Lion of Panjshir, who led strong resistance against Soviet forces in the Panjshir Valley, and built a reputation not just for fighting ability, but also for leadership. But even though these fighters were against the Soviets, they were not united with each other, and that would become a huge problem later. When the Soviets finally withdrew in 1989, it looked like the war was over, but in reality, it was just entering a new phase. The communist government in Kabul held on for a few more years, but by 1992 it collapsed. And that's when everything turned into full-scale civil war between different Mujahideen factions. Groups that had once fought side by side now turned their guns on each other, each trying to control Kabul and the country. Cities, especially Kabul, were hit by constant shelling, rockets, and street fighting. Thousands of civilians were killed, and basic law and order disappeared. This period from 1992 to 94 was pure chaos. Roads were controlled by warlords, kidnappings became common, and people couldn't even travel safely between cities. This chaos is exactly what allowed something new to rise. In 1994 in southern Afghanistan, particularly around Kandahar, a group of religious students, many of whom had grown up in refugee camps in Pakistan and studied in religious schools called madrasas, came together under the leadership of Mullah Omar. They called themselves the Taliban, which simply means students. At first, they were seen by many locals as a solution to the chaos. They promised to disarm warlords, stop corruption, and bring security back to the roads and cities. There are early stories from 1994 where they punished local commanders accused of abusing civilians, and that helped them gain support quickly, especially in areas tired of violence and lawlessness. But while their promise was simple, their ideology was strict. shaped by a very hardline interpretation of religion and influenced by years of war and life in refugee camps. By 1995, the Taliban had already taken large parts of southern Afghanistan, and by September 1996, they entered Kabul, pushing out rival factions and effectively ending the civil war phase, at least on the surface. Their leader, Mullah Omar, was not a typical political figure. He rarely appeared in public, didn't give speeches like other leaders, and avoided the media completely. Instead, he ruled from the background, relying on a small circle of trusted commanders. After taking Kabul, he declared the country the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan, and from that moment, the Taliban began enforcing their version of Islamic law across the country. Life changed overnight, especially for women. Girls' schools were shut down across most areas, and women were banned from working outside their homes in many professions, including teaching and healthcare, except in very limited situations. Women were required to wear the burqa in public, covering them completely from head to toe. If they were seen outside without a male guardian, they could be punished. These rules were enforced by the Taliban's religious police, who carried out public punishments, including beatings. Public executions became a regular part of life, especially in large stadiums like the one in Kabul, where thousands of people would be forced to gather and watch. These executions were meant to send a message, not just to punish individuals, but to show complete control over society. Crimes like murder or adultery could lead to execution, and punishments were carried out openly. But while all of this was happening in public, something very different was happening in private. Taliban leaders kept their personal lives extremely secret. Their wives, children, and extended families were almost completely invisible. There were no official photos, no interviews, and no public records of who these women were or where they lived. Even within Afghanistan, most people had no idea what the families of top Taliban leaders looked like or how they lived. This secrecy wasn't accidental. It was part of their culture, and also a security measure. Many of these leaders had lived through years of war, and they knew that families could be used as leverage. So they kept them hidden, often in rural areas, sometimes moving between locations to avoid detection. At the time, this secrecy seemed like protection, but it also meant that if anything ever happened to these families, there would be very little documentation, very little proof, and a lot of room for rumors to spread. And that's exactly what would happen later. By the late 1990s, the Taliban controlled about 90% of Afghanistan, but they were not recognized by most of the world as the legitimate government. Only a few countries, including Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates, officially recognized them. Meanwhile, opposition forces known as the Northern Alliance continued to fight back, led by figures like Ahmad Shah Massoud, who held out in the north. So even during Taliban rule, the war never fully stopped. It just changed shape, and beneath the surface of strict control and silence, the country was still unstable, still divided, and still one major event away from exploding again. That event came on September 11, 2001. The attacks in the United States changed global politics overnight, and Afghanistan quickly became the main target because the Taliban government was sheltering Osama bin Laden, who was blamed for planning the attacks. The US demanded that the Taliban hand him over, but the Taliban refused, and by October 7, 2001, the United States, along with its allies, launched a military invasion of Afghanistan. The initial phase of the war moved incredibly fast. US airstrikes, combined with ground support for the Northern Alliance, pushed Taliban forces out of major cities within weeks. By November 2001, Kabul had fallen, and by December, the Taliban government had collapsed. Leaders disappeared quickly, some going into hiding in Afghanistan's mountains, others crossing into Pakistan, especially into tribal areas along the border where control was weak. At that moment, it looked like the war was over. A new government was set up in Kabul, and international forces began rebuilding efforts. But the Taliban were not gone. They had simply changed strategy. Instead of holding cities, they went underground, reorganizing in small groups, waiting for the right time to return. By 2003 and 2004, signs of a new conflict were clear. Taliban fighters began launching attacks again, but this time, the war looked completely different. It wasn't about controlling territory in the traditional sense. It was about survival and pressure. They used ambushes on roads, planted improvised explosive devices known as IEDs, and carried out hit-and-run attacks against coalition forces and Afghan government troops. This kind of war is called guerrilla warfare, and it changes everything because it removes clear lines between soldiers and civilians. Fighters don't wear uniforms. They blend into villages. They disappear into normal life. And that makes it extremely difficult to know who is involved and who isn't. As a result, suspicion grew on all sides. US and NATO forces began relying heavily on intelligence to find Taliban fighters, which often came from local informants. Night raids became a key tactic, where forces would enter homes, sometimes based on limited or incorrect information, searching for suspects. These raids were effective in capturing some Taliban members, but they also created anger and fear among civilians, especially when mistakes were made. At the same time, the Taliban began targeting anyone they believed was cooperating with foreign forces or the Afghan government. This included interpreters, police officers, teachers, and even villagers suspected of sharing information. These killings were meant to scare others into staying silent. By the mid-2000s, especially around 2006, the conflict had intensified again. And this time, it was more widespread and more unpredictable. The Taliban insurgency had grown stronger, particularly in southern and eastern provinces like Helmand, Kandahar, and Khost. Coalition forces responded by increasing military operations, sending more troops, and focusing heavily on targeting Taliban leadership. One of the most well-known figures overseeing US and NATO strategy during this period was David Petraeus, who pushed for aggressive counterinsurgency tactics aimed at weakening the Taliban's network. Night raids became more frequent and more precise, often based on intelligence gathered from local sources. These operations were designed to capture or eliminate key Taliban commanders, but they also created a constant sense of fear in rural communities. Homes were entered at night, doors were broken down, and families were questioned or detained. Even when the target was not found, the impact stayed with those families. The Taliban, on the other side, adjusted quickly. They increased attacks on Afghan government officials and anyone seen as supporting foreign forces. Interpreters working with NATO, local police officers, and tribal elders cooperating with the government all became targets. But as the violence escalated, something more disturbing started to happen. Something that wasn't always officially acknowledged, but kept showing up in reports from human rights groups and local witnesses. Families of fighters, especially those connected to known Taliban commanders, began facing threats and pressure. This didn't always come from one side. In some cases, rival Taliban factions targeted each other's families during internal disputes. In other cases, local militias or anti-Taliban groups were accused of harassing or attacking families believed to be linked to insurgents. Women were at the center of this situation. Taliban wives, especially in rural areas where their identities were somewhat known within the communities, lived under constant stress. If their husbands were active fighters or commanders, their homes could be watched, searched, or targeted. Even rumors of association could put them in danger. And because these women were already living under strict restrictions, with limited ability to move or communicate freely, they had almost no way to protect themselves. At the same time, the Taliban continued enforcing their own harsh rules within the areas they controlled. Women accused of violating their strict codes, whether it was related to behavior, relationships, or even suspicion of contact with government forces, could face severe punishment. Some of these punishments were carried out in public, while others happened quietly and were known only through local accounts. But something new quietly changed how that war was seen, not just inside the country, but across the world. Mobile phones started spreading fast, even into remote villages where electricity itself was not always reliable. cheap phones with basic cameras became common. And suddenly, events that once stayed hidden in isolated areas were being recorded in real time. The shift became very clear around 2010 to 2012, when more videos started appearing online and in media reports. One of the most widely known and disturbing cases happened in 2012 in Parwan province, not far from Kabul. A young woman named Najiba was accused of adultery by Taliban members, and she was executed in a public setting. The video showed her sitting on the ground, surrounded by men, before being shot multiple times. The footage spread quickly, first locally through phones, and then internationally through news outlets. It shocked people not just because of the act itself, but because for many it was the first time they were actually seeing something like this happen, instead of just hearing about it. But what often gets overlooked is that these videos were not always recorded just to document punishment. They served a purpose, and that purpose was control. For the Taliban, in some cases, recording and sharing these acts was a way to show authority, to send a clear warning about what would happen if rules were broken. At the same time, not every video came directly from the Taliban. Rival groups, local militias, or even individuals sometimes recorded these incidents. In some situations, footage was leaked deliberately, either to expose Taliban actions or to damage their reputation. Intelligence networks and media organizations also played a big role, picking up these clips and spreading them further. Once a video left its original source, it was almost impossible to control how it was interpreted. This created a strange situation where the same type of video could mean very different things depending on who was sharing it, and rumors started to grow quickly. In villages, in refugee communities, and even online, people began talking about women being executed, not just for personal accusations, but because of who they were connected to. Stories spread about wives of fighters being punished, about families being used as leverage, about private revenge being carried out under the cover of religious law. Some of these stories were based on real events, especially in cases where women were accused and punished by Taliban groups. But others were exaggerated or completely unverified, growing larger each time they were retold. In 2015, something happened that shook the Taliban from the inside, and most people outside Afghanistan didn't fully understand how big it was at the time. The group officially announced that their founder, Mullah Omar, had died 2 years earlier in 2013. For years, many fighters believed he was still alive, leading the movement from hiding. So when the truth came out, it created distrust, anger, and confusion across the entire organization. The immediate problem was leadership. Once it became clear that Mullah Omar was gone, different Taliban factions started competing for control. Mullah Akhtar Mansour was announced as the new leader, but not everyone accepted him. Some commanders believed the decision was forced or illegitimate, while others saw it as a chance to break away and form their own groups. This led to internal clashes, especially in strong Taliban areas like Helmand and parts of Zabul and Kunduz. These were not small disagreements. Fighters who had once been on the same side started turning their weapons on each other. Assassinations became more common. Commanders were targeted not just by external enemies, but by their own former allies. Loyalty became uncertain, and switching sides could mean survival for some, while for others it meant becoming a target. In this kind of unstable environment, families lost whatever protection they once had. Before this, being part of a Taliban leader's household often meant staying hidden, but relatively safe within their controlled areas. But once internal fighting started, that safety began to break down. Rival factions sometimes went after each other's networks, and that included people connected to them directly or indirectly. There were reports from provinces like Helmand and Kunduz of revenge killings linked to these internal disputes. These were not always publicly announced or officially claimed, which made them harder to verify, but they were mentioned repeatedly in local accounts and security reports. Some of these incidents were targeted killings of fighters, while others involved pressure on families, intimidation, or violence meant to send a message. In August 2021, everything changed again. And this time it happened faster than almost anyone expected. After nearly 20 years of war, US and NATO forces completed their withdrawal from Afghanistan. As they left, Taliban fighters began advancing across the country, capturing province after province, with little resistance in many areas. Afghan government forces, despite years of training and support, collapsed quickly in several regions. By mid-August, the Taliban had reached Kabul. The Afghan president at the time, Ashraf Ghani, fled the country, and within days the Taliban took control of the capital without a major battle. For many Afghans, it felt like everything had changed overnight, just like it had in the 1990s. But this time the situation was different in one important way. The world was watching more closely. Social media, smartphones, and global news coverage meant that events inside Afghanistan were being shared almost instantly. The Taliban were aware of this, and in the early days of their return to power, they tried to present a more controlled image, promising stability and saying things would be different from their previous rule. Public executions and punishments became less visible, at least at first, compared to the 1996-2001 period. But that didn't mean violence had stopped. Reports began emerging of revenge attacks, disappearances, and targeted killings, especially against people connected to the previous government, security forces, or foreign organizations. Women connected to the former government or international organizations faced serious risk. Many went into hiding, fearing retaliation. At the same time, women connected to Taliban factions also faced pressure, especially in areas where internal rivalries or local disputes still existed. And once again, as in earlier years, the violence returned.